So,
we read some of it?
yes, Louis is, so this essay is a rather recent one, rather recent, it's 2012, from a special issue of a magazine called Differences, yes. So,
Founded by Naomi Shaw and Elizabeth Weed, so they're really, really brilliant feminist intellectuals and sustained as this incredible place where such a range of important work has been published. So it's worth, if you've not come across Differences, just Googling it and going back through the copies, you'll find a treasure house of
yes,
feminist thinking.
yes, coming out of Brown University, yeah. So this text was written after the notebook for the dOCUMENTA, which is about how the void is not void, and it is full. And it's written after her book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. And it's written, so it's the most recent, I think, of the text that you have in your reader. So I guess what we do now is we read. So shall I read out loud? How do we do this? I read out loud. Okay, so when two hands touch, there is a sensuality of the flesh, an exchange of warmth, a feeling of pressure, of presence, a proximity of otherness that brings the other nearly as close as oneself. There's a footnote. Let's find the footnote. The title of my essay, I just have the first ones here, of my essay here expresses my virtual engagement and entanglements with Derrida. The reason is because of his text, L'animal que donc je suis. I am indebted to Astrid Schrader and Vicky Kirby for putting me in touch with Derrida through their marvelous materialist readings of his work. Vicky Kirby could have been something we would be reading today, by the way. One of you had me note is that this, it is quite surprising that she's not referencing Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of perception, where he does speak in a very specific chapter about the question of, would you like to?
It's in the essay I Am Mind.
Yes.
And it's just one little paragraph. I reread the
Yes,
essay again
would you?
last night. And you might be right, actually, because it's about the entwining of vision and touch. But there is, there is this moment
you have to have this.
where he talks about
Wait.
touching your own hand
Yes.
with the other hand, which
He does that. in
Yeah,
the
he
text,
does
yes.
that. There's a paragraph which we can talk about later if we need to.
But I don't believe that she was coming from that trajectory at all. So, an exchange of warmth, a feeling of pressure, of presence, a proximity of otherness that brings the other nearly as close as oneself. Nor do I think that she's referencing or read Levinas either, this question of what it is to be near. I think there's somewhere also Levinas speaks about the touch in Totalité et Infini or something. Perhaps closer. And if the two hands belong to one person,
that's the one.
that's the one.
Yeah, you would have to
have this, please.
No, well, I don't think so. I don't think she knew.
No, okay. That's all right. That's fine.
I don't think she knew. But go ahead. Why don't you keep it there? Because I don't need it.
Let's put it in the middle. Okay, fine.
Anyway, it's not a bad thing, because had she known that text, she would have probably put it in a footnote, but it isn't where she's going in this essay. In the sense that Merleau-Ponty is still connected to a subjectivist. He's one of the moments of the development of post-Kantian subjectivism, which means to know the world, but not just to know it with your eyes, but to know it with your body, with touch, with all the senses. However, the Merleau-Ponty was known quite well by the arte povera artists.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So perhaps closer. And if the two hands belong to one person, might this not enliven an uncanny sense of the otherness of the self, a literal holding oneself at a distance in the sensation of contact, the greeting of the stranger within? So much happens in a touch, an infinity of others, other beings, other spaces, other times are aroused. When two hands touch, how close are they? What is the measure of closeness? Again here, I don't think she even has read Heidegger. I don't think Karen Barad comes from that. She would have somehow brought it in and criticized it in some way, as she did with the Derrida. It's like from another universe, her thinking, I believe. So she doesn't use the word nearness on purpose, I mean, because she doesn't know that, I think. Or not necessarily. We can ask her. I'm going to write an email and find out. So,
Can I make a point?
yes, this is not how we read. Yes, I need to learn how we read together.
it's
How
okay,
do we
okay.
read together?
I just want to clarify. I think there are ways in which scholars have to recognize genealogies of ideas. Okay, so one thing we're training PhD students to do is that you can't just set off in a certain direction. And one of the things you do as a scholar, or we do as a scholar, is to find these
Reference.
histories and
Sources.
put them in conversation. The individual person who's coming up with a new idea probably does it from inside. So Merleau-Ponty came from within wherever Merleau-Ponty came and probably wasn't aware of other things. So I think both spaces are right, that the exploring certain questions here, but she's setting this up in order to tell us the very opposite of Merleau-Ponty,
Yes.
which is to say you didn't touch yourself at all.
Yes.
So I think it's very interesting because you've pointed out, you know, there are conversations about closeness, there are conversations about the touch in different places, which then would be interesting in a scholarly way to say, so what happens if we have these different formulations?
Yes, it would
at
be
different
very
points?
interesting
But in
to
this case,
analyze.
we need to get what Barad is putting into the world in the terms of arriving at it from physics.
Yes,
And that, I
that's
think,
it,
is
arriving at it from physics.
which is what none of us would normally arrive at. We
Yes.
might think about philosophy, but most of us here are not, apart from Jenny, arriving at it from physics. So that's the exciting bit.
Yes, and that is actually what characterizes feminist science studies, that they are situated knowledges. There are women all over the world in science labs right now, moving from cultural studies to science labs. One example is Elizabeth Wilson, who was trained in cultural studies and then went off and did biology. So there are, this is a kind of a characteristic. Or Vinciane Després, she's actually working with farmers and pigs in her study of the non-human relations in labor conditions. So Barad is an example of that. So I should stop commenting and just read it. So, what is the measure of closeness? Which disciplinary knowledge formations, political parties, and religious and cultural traditions, infectious disease authorities, immigration officials, and policymakers do not have a stake in, if not a measured answer to this question? When touch is at issue, nearly everyone's hair stands on end. I can barely touch on, I like the language where she uses metaphor in a real way and then uses real in a metaphorical way and so on. I can barely touch on even a few aspects of touch here, at most offering the barest suggestion of what it might mean to approach, to dare to come in contact with this infinite finitude. Again, it's an interesting thing because it is almost a reply, and it comes after the book, after finitude. But I don't think she was referencing directly after finitude when she wrote this infinite finitude. It coming from physics, as Griselda says. Now, what do you think about can I ask questions while we read? Yeah. What do you think about the question that she's referring to everyone being invested or having a stake in touching? And what might that evoke in you? Immigration officials, etc. Health and safety regulations in museums. There is an artist, Christina Buch, in the dOCUMENTA, whose work, she made that butterfly garden, the garden for the butterflies. One of her recent pieces is a monochrome paintings made with candy, and the visitors are supposed to lick it until it disappears. And she's having a very hard time exhibiting this work.
Nobody wants to be seen licking a paint.
Well, mostly the
Health and safety reasons.
yes, health and safety reasons, because there is this fear. So we live, yes. So we live in this world where we are supposed to be put in contact, put in touch through separating devices and emails, cell phones and smartphones and airplanes that connect Kabul and Kassel. But we actually go over the planet. You don't actually touch much, and touching is very much part of a phobia. Of there's all this sanitation going on, the liquids when you travel and so on. So I think she's referring to this, that we live in this absolute fear, not only of the terrorist, but fear of touching, because we are afraid we will die, or we are told that we should be afraid we will die, we will get sick. I think that's why she finds also that it is that getting in, touching is important. Many voices speak here in the interstices, a cacophony of always already reiteratively interacting stories. So she uses her word, it's her word, interacting. Although she refers to it as somebody else's, so she's the person who popularized it, let's say. There's maybe a footnote in one of her earlier books that explains the source of the word interacting, which I associate with her. These
Can we just explain it? Can we have a
we did, yes. Well, yesterday I mentioned it when in the lecture. To interact means that you presuppose there are two entities which come into contact, and they interact, and then they produce something which is a third thing from that interaction. Interaction means that there is nothing, and then the two entities that are interacting come into existence through their interacting. So matter actually doesn't, so there isn't space and time and they interact, or there isn't an electron and another thing that exist and then they interact. To see physics as a situation of entanglements where the two entities come into being in the moment that they're interacting. For example, if you take a photon and you throw it through a slit and you split it into two photons, these two photons didn't exist before, and they are entangled, because when you split a photon in two with a the traditional quantum physics way of entangling photons is you split one, and then the two somehow have a memory of each other, and they are forever entangled. So if one photon does this, the other photon does that. And then this one does this and this one does that. This is the basis of future so-called quantum communications that will be based on the fact that you do not send any message. There's no information, but the elements in the two distant points are entangled.
Is that related to time travel?
Oh, I don't know if it's related to time travel, but it's certainly related to the physical world that we live in, which is a world of entangled beings and interactively generating themselves. And it's very visible on the small level. Now they're in physics labs trying to entangle big things like atoms. But to do that, you have to freeze them and make them very cold so that you can actually do that with an atom. But it's proven in a laboratory only on smaller elements that they're entangled through their coming into the world. And the way that you disentangle is one of the two has to be entangled with another, has to be then itself entangled with something else. So in a strange way, the stories that we are telling each other are partly binary. I mean, entanglement occurs between two, not three, but then they're constantly re-entangling themselves. So it's a multiplicity, but it's interesting if one has to rethink the question of the binary for a moment. And one of the notebooks that investigated that question in a incredibly rich way was the anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, speaking about binary and early structuralism and Lévi-Strauss. And maybe second institute I could put that notebook on the reading. But to go back to this, interaction is that. It's the fact that we come into the world, we're not, two things or more things are not there, and then they're there together, and they're there in the moment of an interaction. They cannot come into the world alone. That's the basic of interaction. So these are entangled tales. It's interesting that she uses the word tale, because she is aware of the fact that science is situated, knowledge is, and always has been. And this is quite clear in our studies ever since Foucault, for example, Archaeology of Knowledge, that you may have read in your studies, but even more so after Bruno Latour's work on these subjects. For example, in the book Pandora's Hope, which is a marvelous book by Bruno Latour on the question of science being so much determined by the stories that the scientists want to tell. So that would mean that also Karen Barad is telling a tale, whether it's the tale of the queerness of the physical world or whatever. It is just as much the world telling us that as we telling the world in a way. And so each is diffractively each what? Oh, each story. Okay. Each is diffractively threaded through and enfolded into the other. Is that not in the nature of touching? Is touching not by its very nature always already an involution, invitation, invisitation, wanted or unwanted, of the stranger within? So what is it to touch oneself? She'll go. What does that mean? And who is oneself anyway, if not that diffracted multiplicity? Each of the essays in this special, oh no, there's a footnote. The footnote says, touch has been an object of study for centuries, going back at least to Aristotle's momentous work on this topic, which evidently she has read. Part of what is at stake in this essay and others in this issue, because this essay is also a little bit like an introduction to the whole issue. The issue is marvelous. I really suggest that you pick it up. There is a fantastic article by Natasha Myers and Carla Hustak on Darwin and Darwin's interest in orchids, and the fact that he was stuck by the fact that it made no sense that insects and orchids would interact when there was no need to do that, because there is no pollination. They are not flowers that need to be pollinated. So this kind of stuckness or fascination that he had with orchids, and he wrote about orchids, and he had orchids in his house, and he also imitated orchids. He would try to figure it out, so there's this whole article. And of course the sexual analogies of the orchid shape and so on. So they were speaking in this article, which is in this essay, about multi-species desire, and the desire and the seduction that goes on between, for example, certain insects and certain plants. And the fact that it would be for evolutionary purposes, like bees and pollination of flowers, makes it sort of okay. It's like having sex to have children. But the fact of the orchid makes it not comprehensible, because it is a space of play. And so how can there be this space of play in evolution? So that is one of the many articles in this issue that I strongly advise reading.
Through the Brotherton, it's on the collection we have, just 2012 differences.
Yes. So each of these essays in this special issue touches on questions of touching, coupling and decoupling, entanglement, sensation, immersion, visual hapticity, ciliated sense. I guess that means the cilia with the these are the cilia. What is ciliated sense? What does that mean?
The little things in your gut. You've got little cilia, which are these,
Oh, really?
these little, like fingers of stuff that move things along and touch.
In your
touch
guts?
us. Yeah. There's a villi. Oh, sorry, I thought they were cilia. Oh, look at that.
Different size, the villi are large, but the
on the
cilia
edge
are
of-
microscopic.
On the edge of things like...
Oh, that's right. Okay, we have a scientist.
What? What?
The cilia are at a microscopic level on the surface of the cell. You have a multitude of cells. Which
Oh, so it's what makes them sentient, perceiving their
you get
environment.
cilia on
Yes.
a lot of microscopic animals.
Yes.
you can touch, or
So
like
yes,
a sea anemone.
yes, which is why cilia means this in Latin, I guess.
That's the definition.
This stuff. What does it say? eyelash. So cilium is eyelash. My mother was an archaeologist. I only know things this way. It's the only way, but it's interesting. So cilium, which is eyelash, the plural is cilia, is an organelle found in eukaryotic cells, which is, by the way, the field that Lynn Margulis became well known for and almost got the Nobel Prize for, was her study of endosymbiotic evolution in looking at the eukaryotic cell. So the cilia obviously serve the purpose of sensory. That's why they are things that help us feel the world, or help keep out things like our eyelashes, so you don't get dust in your eyes. And so there we go. So ciliatic. What did she say? Ciliated sense. Okay. The synthetic force of perceiving and feeling, contact, affective ecology, involution. Involution is actually a term that I think was coined by Natasha Myers and Carla Hustak, as opposed to evolution. And it is again one of these feminist attempts at, yes, staying in the idea that the physical world is not the fruit of God, you know, a religious thing, but modifying Darwinian thinking to incorporate all these other directions, which are not just competition for the survival of the fittest. So involution is this way in which two entities come together sort of from within. Is it correct that involution comes from involution, a function, and it's the shrinking of a turning in on oneself?
You can sometimes get it with a hair. It's quite dangerous if a hair grows in instead of out.
Yes, but the use of the word involution is not that, I think. I think she's speaking about a non-competitive notion of evolution. So
I have to make one comment.
this is too slow.
No, this is fine. It's just a comment. Darwin never talked about survival of the fittest. That is the sociologist Herbert Spencer. Darwinian theory is adaptation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There is no
Yes.
purpose. There's no. So it's not
It's
that, you know,
incorrect
the
what I
fittest.
said.
I've
Competition.
even heard professors in this University of Scientists saying it in Senate, and little old art historian jumped up and said, Darwin
Never said that.
it isn't about the survival of the fittest. So there's not. It's not. But evolution has a certain. It does a trajectory, but it's interesting.
Can you explain a little bit more? So it's an adaptation of Darwinian thinking to other people, through other people.
Herbert Spencer was a sociologist who created social Darwinism and applied Darwin's theory to 19th century capitalist society to justify a kind of dog-eat-dog vision of the world,
yes.
as opposed to presumably that adaptation is entirely peculiar and fanciful. In a sense, why things adapt to their environment and then develop whatever they develop is not because they're fitter than anybody else, but they are fit to their environment.
Yes.
And their chances, therefore, of surviving qua themselves and passing on are increased. So they're not wiping out. We can't just say that we will have a better, a top wasp and the rest of them are going to be kept in poverty because they're just not fit enough to make a million. Right? It just is that if you do actually adapt to the environment, the chances of your passing on your genes and those genes increasing. So it's not a competitive model as far as I understand it.
Yes, but it is a singular model, adaptation. So what I think involution, maybe we should look up involution and Natasha Myers because they speak in that, Myers.
I mean, the function of its own inverse, though, that definition up there was the closest to the way that I read that sentence.
Oh, here it is. Yes.
It's touching not by its very nature, always already an involution. And
Yes.
There was the definition up there was it's gone.
Okay, here we are. We've got a little quotation here.
The way that, while we're getting that, the way that Lynn Margulis speaks of this question, she writes, contrary to, she doesn't use the word involution because Lynn Margulis' word is endosymbiosis. But just let's read this first and then this, or this. Just let me read, because I have this book open. It says, contrary to the insistence of neo-Darwinist animal scientists, so maybe it's the neo-Darwinist that we are here to criticize, the accumulation of random mutation in genes is neither the only source of evolutionary novelty nor the major source. More diverse and original than animals are the bacteria and protocysts of the microscopic world. Inside this world, at our feet, beyond and inside us, it is easy to see that life forms of many different shapes and sizes interact, merge, and complexify. Working together to gain access to energy and material for sustenance and growth, organisms unite to form new, larger organisms. Some go on to form societies and communities that fractally complexify on a larger scale. Together, they accomplish what would be impossible for them to do on their own. Over the course of evolution, living beings sensed their immediate environments and one another. Cell awareness was here from the time of the origin of earliest life. Awareness and sensation continue to evolve into full-blown consciousness as we humans experience and verbalize it. That's not exactly what we're talking about, but it is I mean, at least it is somehow similar. It's connected. In what way? Let's read this. Okay.
Formulation of evolution.
Okay.
Co-evolution of organisms.
Yes.
Not on competitive.
Well, let me.
Let's.
Okay, this essay puts forward a theory of affective ecologies encompassing plant, animal, and human interactions. The author's formulation of involution favors a co-evolution of organisms that act not on competitive pressures, but on affective relations.
Yes.
Drawing in particular from and challenging Darwinian and neo-Darwinian accounts of orchid-insect contact.
There we go.
And controversial research on plant communication, Hustak and Myers demonstrate the interdependence of seemingly unrelated life forms. The involving entity within this framework is not an individual organism, but a community of organisms in communication with one another, exemplified by the transmission of information through chemical signaling amongst plants, which forces readers to question what it means to communicate. This relationality also begs a reconsideration of the dynamic between a human subject who conducts an experiment and an animal or plant object of study, which the essay approaches by showing how Darwin became a participant in his own orchid experiments. Taken together, these feminist readings of ecological and evolutionary phenomena result in the dissolution of species and even kingdom boundaries.
Yes. So Griselda, I guess it's about involution between different species, that we shouldn't even speak that way because it's contradictory to an involution theory to even speak of different species. So it's close to the notion of intra-action as opposed to interaction. You can't say two species evolved together because it's using the wrong language to speak about what is occurring.
She's using it as a definition of touching, though, in this sentence.
Yes. Okay, so should we move on or should we stay with this question of adaptation of the individual? Maybe the point is that Darwin was looking at the adaptation of some sort of individual species or entity versus this idea of a relational coming together which changes the world.
But if we were focusing on stories in one sense, Darwin could arrive at evolution at the state in which science was at the time, which itself is also within the ideological parameters of colonialism, rampant capitalism, all sorts of models, which, as we know with Freud, the same thing, make possible, but also perhaps set inner limits to the imagination. But then when you have that field, then an intervention can come, queer or feminist or post-colonial, which doesn't have to kill Darwin, right? But it allows us to see more clearly what was invisible or blocked, you know, or foreclosed in the Darwinian model by that work of a certain ideological stoppage. Whereas here, we then move on to this, and it is a jump of logic, which of course some of us are very familiar with in the sort of in the battle with psychoanalysis from certain matrixial points of view, is how to think a co-becoming of of entities that can
Yes.
only exist because the other is also becoming in a, you know, in this kind of
Yes.
notion of co-affection. So it is where we jump outside of the kind of, as you said, the classic metaphysical Western logic of self and other,
Yeah.
and you know, subject and object, which
Mind, body, and
underpins so many of
Mhm.
these problems that we are trying to undo in the, you know, in the post-colonial queer and feminist thinking.
Yes.
Pass this down.
I just wanted to say though that it isn't a leap in this essay because she's using touch as the mechanism for us to think it.
Yes. Yes, we
That's
will
precisely why we're
Yes.
using touch.
get there. Yes.
I mean, it isn't a great leap to think about it because
No,
if you
it's
touch,
not.
you're doing it.
But we're going to
She's
get
going
to that.
say you don't actually ever touch.
Well, no,
That's
she's going to
what-
say that from the perspective of classical
Yeah,
science,
exactly.
and then she's going to say that you only actually touch.
Yeah, precisely.
And they are both true
Okay.
depending on if you're using the classical science or not. But so we should go on. But I also just one more thing comes to my mind though, Griselda, because why not say these things that come to our mind? From what you are saying, it reminds me that of course Darwin comes into the picture when at that time there was the belief that, or the dominant belief that God, there was the Christian belief system in the West and in Europe. So what he was doing was very radical to say that we share something with the orangutan and with the fish and with the lamb. I mean, it was a very radical break with the dominant ideology of the time that he did. And he and others, many others together. So that's very important. But it also is paradoxically occurring at the same time when the so-called animals, I mean, if one were to sort of superficially psychoanalyze that whole thing, it happens at the same time as the machine age is developing a lot. So it's a paradox that one is finding or looking for those connectivities with the non-human animal bodies at the same time as the society itself is separating you from them. There's less and less horses carrying your thing. There's less and less relation of your daily life with the sunlight because of the electric light. So in the moment when we make this break between the animal and the human animal and the non-human animal is exactly the moment in which on the level of science we're saying there is that connection. As if it wasn't possible to speak it before because it was too scary to be so close. People living with their cats and dogs and horses and sheep and in the cities. Okay, so strange and wonderful intimacies, sensory attunement, arousal, response, interspecies signaling, affectively charged multisensory dance, technological intimacies, remembering, figuring, embodied mathematics. So these are all the subjects of the other essays in this issue that she's basically listing. I am struck by the intimacy of feminist science studies engagement with science. Feminist science studies distinguishes itself in two intra-related ways. First and foremost, for all the varied approaches, foci, so focuses, and philosophical commitments that go by this name, for all its diversity and because of all its diversity, it is a richly inventive endeavor committed to making a better world. I love that sentence. That's, I think, what committed means, no? In a way. Second, and relatedly, and I think that's also, Secondly, and relatedly, it distinguishes itself by its commitment to be in the science, not to presume to be above or outside of it. In other words, feminist science studies engages with the science no less than with the laboratory workers, modelers, theorists, technicians, and technologies. Indeed, the approach I find most intriguing, fruitful, grounded, rigorous, and delightful is when feminist science studies is of the science, materially immersed in and inseparable from it. In some way, I'd like to just stop a second. In some way, this makes me think about Judith Barry's text about the brain of dOCUMENTA. The way that she said it was not about being in time, but being inside time. So it's not really about science, but being inside science. Like good bench scientists, these practitioners work the equipment, theoretical and experimental, without any illusion of clean hands and unapologetically express their enthusiasm and amazement for the world and the possibilities of fostering just relationships among the world's diverse ways of being, becoming. Bruno Latour's book, Pandora's Hope, is all about this, the test tubes and the time it takes to walk to that forest where you're going to get your leaves from, and this embodiedness of the science practice, which is seen that way very close to art, or the way that we usually define art. Theorizing, a form of experimenting, is about being in touch. What keeps theories alive and lively is being responsible and responsive to the world's patternings and murmurings. Doing theory, now patternings and murmurings, I think she is referring to Whitehead. Whitehead is often read by feminist science studies today. Isabel Stengers has written essays about Whitehead. If you Google Whitehead and Isabel Stengers and Haraway, they even were on a panel discussion together. Whitehead, well, that's a whole, we could bring some Whitehead in, but I think this is where the question of patterning and why patterns matter and what patterns are, that then turns into Bateson and then turns into cybernetics and so on. Yes, it is Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, actually, who is very problematic on certain ways. But if you do Whitehead Stengers, for example, Alfred is correct, but Stengers is Stengers, or Haraway, or whatever. You'll come out with thinking with Whitehead. Yeah. It's very interesting looking at a thinker from the beginning of the century. But I just give that as a moment because otherwise we don't get through page 3. But that's, I believe, where the question of patterning and theorizing with, the world that theorizes, the world that thinks. You know, if you make a spider web, you're thinking. I mean, it is theorizing the world from the perspective or the Umwelt of the spider. Doing theory requires being open to the world's aliveness, allowing oneself to be lured by curiosity, surprise, and wonder. Theories are not mere metaphysical pronouncements on the world from some presumed position of exteriority. Theories are living and breathing reconfigurations of the world. The world theorizes as well as experiments with itself, figuring, reconfiguring. Animate and so-called inanimate creatures do not merely embody mathematical theories, they do mathematics. If you see the spider web in that way, it's doing mathematics. The ball, if I throw a ball, there's a very beautiful essay by Michel Serres, S-E-R-R-E-S, who is basically the mentor of Bruno Latour. I think he's just recently died, actually, Michel Serres. And he wrote an essay in the 70s or something like that, late 70s, called The Quasi-Object, or On the Quasi-Object. You recognize it? You have read it? No. Heard about it. And it's a very interesting essay where he says, when you play a ball, is the ball player throwing the ball and has power over the ball where it's going to go? Or is the ball player following the ball and reacting to the ball, being pulled by the ball, basically, in the game? And the truth is, or quote-unquote truth, is that both are true, and it's in this balance that the concept of the quasi-object, and it's in this balance. And he speaks about all this calculation that the ball is making. So the ball is making theory. You know, the ball is realizing the atmosphere, the temperature, the wind. We barely approximate with our knowledge of aerodynamics the knowledge of a ball. You know, the ball knows a lot more than we do when we build an airplane. It's an enormous amount of theory that's going on if you look at it from the perspective of the sentientness of that inanimate object, calculating how to fall or where to fall. Anyway, so excuse me? Yeah. Hermes. Yes, that's so interesting. So she's setting a stage for us to read about matter thinking, or that the two things are the same thing. Mattering, the subject matter, and matter as materials are actually doing the same thing. But life, and we do it in our own way, you know. For example, when we do theory, we are mattering as well. But life, whether organic or inorganic, animate or inanimate, is not an unfolding algorithm. So at the same time, it's not an unfolding algorithm. Electrons, molecules, brittle stars, jellyfish, coral reefs, dogs, rocks, icebergs, plants, asteroids, snowflakes, and bees stray from all calculable paths, making leaps here and there, or rather making here and there from leaps, shifting familiarly patterned practices, testing the waters of what might yet be, have been, could still have been, doing thought experiments with their very being. So she's always saying one thing and the opposite as both true at the same time. So the world theorizes, the world is calculating in every moment when this happens, but it is also straying from that pattern or algorithm constantly, which is what we would see as accidents or as imagination or as creativity. Or I think Whitehead is the one who used creativity the first time, also the word, I think. And she says the thought experiments, do you know what thought experiments are? Or in the history of quantum physics notions of, for example, parallel universes or entanglement were known on a mathematical level as thought experiments, even at the time of Einstein. Einstein said that Schrödinger was, of course, right, but we couldn't think it. You know, it was not thinkable. He didn't want to go there. But those are called Gedanken experiment, thought experiments. Then only very recently, in the late 1970s, have these thought experiments been done on a laboratory level. For example, Anton Zellinger. So when the thought experiment is not just abstractly right in the algorithm, but it's done on a laboratory level, it's no longer a thought experiment, it's an experiment. So, so here she's referring to the fact that even the experiment in the lab is a thought experiment, and the thought, she's again saying they are the same in a way. They're happening at the same time. Thought experiments are material matters. That's her way of saying this. Thinking has never been a disembodied or uniquely human activity. Stepping into the void, opening to possibilities, straying, going out of bounds, off the beaten path, diverging and touching down again, swerving and returning, not as consecutive moves, but as experiments in indeterminacy. Indeterminacy, both being determined and indetermined. For example, the basic thought experiment was that light can be both matter and wave. And it depends on how you look at it. And in particles of light can sometimes be observed as matter and sometimes as wave. And this goes against the definition of matter of classical physics. And you don't really know why. Sometimes it comes out that way and sometimes that way. So that is this sort of indeterminacy of these leaps beyond the algorithm. Spinning off in any old direction is neither theorizing nor viable. It loses the thread, the touch of entangled beings becoming together apart. It is amazing the way that her language is so close to, in some ways, to Bracha's. And yet I don't think Bracha has read Karen Barad or Karen Barad has read, because they are like in a different, coming from a different trajectory, a genealogy. But it is interesting. It would be nice to put them together in a conference. All life forms, including, we can do that maybe. All life forms, including inanimate forms of liveliness, do theory. The idea is to do collaborative research, to be in touch in ways that enable responsibility. Even the way of using language is similar. Communicating, responsibility. The ability to respond as being responsibility. Measurement is surely a form of touching. Okay, so measurement is the typical classical science way of knowing the world. You measure time, you measure space, you measure the landscape, and so on, to control it. But measurement is surely in itself a form of touching. Heisenberg got that part right. So are chemical reactions. Of course, if you put two things together and it makes a chemical reaction, it's a form of touching. Maxwell's demon, like every good experimentalist, would be lost if he or she did not have a highly developed sense of touch, a feel for the instruments and molecules at hand. Can someone remind me Maxwell's demon? I don't remember now. I looked it up when I read this article, and now I cannot remember. Maxwell, yes, Maxwell is classical science. Yes, well, early physics, 20th century. But Maxwell's demon would be lost if he or she did not have a highly developed sense of touch, a feel for the instruments and molecules at hand. I think it's, okay, Maxwell's demon is a thought experiment created by Maxwell to show that the second law of thermodynamics has only a statistical certainty. It demonstrates Maxwell's point by hypothetically describing how to violate the second law. A container of gas molecules at equilibrium is divided into two parts by an insulated wall with a door that can be opened and closed by what came to be called Maxwell's demon. Oh, so Maxwell's demon is the experimentalist who actually opens and closes the door, in a way. The demon opens the door to allow only the faster than average molecules to flow through to a favored side of the chamber, and only the slower than average molecules to the other side, causing the favored side to gradually heat up while the other side cools down, thus decreasing entropy. So basically this, it's like what you were talking about, I guess, the body, the missing body of the art historian, or the art. So it says you cannot have this experiment without, so Maxwell's demon would be the scientist, the figure of the scientist who's opening and closing this door. How was university before Wikipedia?
There were people called scholars who knew things. Or only knew things in certain ways. No, I don't think that the demon is
a character.
The scientist. It's actually to do with something. Kelvin used the word demon for Maxwell's concept, by which he intended the mediating rather than malevolent connotation. So something causes this division, and then we get this.
I might show you a little bit further on.
Here we are. There's a schematic.
Yes,
here.
but isn't the demon the person who's, you see the little demon is the missing scientist who opens and closes the door. Because it's a thought experiment, you don't actually open and close the door. But what she's saying is that even a thought experiment is material. So the demon touches.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so where are we? Here. Anyway, Maxwell's demon, like every good experimentalist, would be lost if he or she did not have a highly developed sense of touch, a feel for the instruments and molecules at hands. Good hands, that's what it's called. And touch engages us in a felt sense of causality, whether we generally acknowledge that or not. And whatever it is we may think of this charged and highly important term, touch moves and affects what it affects. In an important sense, touch is the primary concern of physics. That's true. All physics is about what happens when things touch each other. Mm-hmm. Its entire history can be understood as the struggle to articulate what touch entails. How do particles sense one another? Through direct contact and ether, action at a distance, forces, fields, the exchange of virtual particles. What does the exchange of energy entail? How is a change in motion effected? What is pressure? What is temperature? How does the eye see? Of course, the eye is, light refracted off in the lens is being touched in the eyeball. How do lenses work? What are the different kinds of forces that particles experience? How many kinds are there? Once you start looking at it this way, you get a dizzying feeling as things shift. This particular take on physics and its history may entail a torquing, a perturbation from the usual storylines, but it is far from a gross distortion. I offer this twist on the usual framing as a provocation for opening up new ways of thinking about both physics and touch. Inspired by the essays in this issue to stay in touch with material affective dimensions of doing and engaging science, and using this invitation to go out of bounds while staying in touch, in the remainder of this essay, I explore the physics of touch and its physicality, its virtuality, its affectivity, its emotionality, whereby all pretense of being able to separate out the affective from the scientific dimensions of touching falls away. For somehow, I don't know how, but I think this does resonate with the way I put together the brain. A kind of oniric or dream space, somehow mimicking an exhibition, but not quite an exhibition, where the intellectual linkages that were made were not separate from affective linkages that were made amongst the objects. It makes sense to me. Okay, theorizing touching. So now we're in the classical physics way of looking at touch. Touch for a physicist is but an electromagnetic interaction. A common explanation for the physics of touching is that one thing it does is to not involve, well, touching. That is, there is no actual contact involved. You may think you are touching a coffee mug when you are about to raise it to your mouth, but your hand is not actually touching the mug. Sure, this is interesting that the mug always comes, you know, the jug, the mug, and again, I don't know if she read Heidegger's The Thing. It's not part of her genealogy, but it's a wonderful thing that this mug and this vessel is so important to thinkers of all sorts and coming from all different ways. And it is archaically, you know, the uterus also, the holding, our original holding entity, this kind of container, you know, which is why there were so many vessels in the brain, actually. And there were also the vessels that the mother and the daughter, Juana, there are two women who are from Colombia, mother and daughter, who do pottery, and their incredible vessels are being collected, actually. You know, Museum of Modern Art bought them and so on. Then it's not important if it's art or not art, but what is important is that they are making these vessels without a opening. So if you looked at them in the dOCUMENTA, should I just show those pictures? The uniqueness about them is that they found a way to make a vessel that doesn't explode even though it doesn't have an opening. So,
In the kiln, do you mean?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, it does. The reality is there is an opening, but you don't see them.
Say, it will blow up if there's
Yes, it's true, or maybe it's not true. Who knows? Here they are. So this is the. So this is the Cumela. So Cumela was a modernist artist who was invited. The story behind this object is that Cumela is from Barcelona. He's dead now, and he was a modernist artist who made pottery as his medium, and he kept getting invited by. I think it was Werner Haftmann. No, he kept getting invited by Arnold Bode to the dOCUMENTA, and then he would get deleted from the dOCUMENTA before the dOCUMENTA would open. Because Werner Haftmann, who was the art historian, modernist thinker, who was counseling Bode, because Bode was an amateur artist, curator, art historian, and would always throw Cumela out before the opening. So when we did the brain, I thought we should invite Cumela, but Cumela had died, and Chus Martinez, who's from Barcelona, went to the estate and asked the family if she could invite some works into the dOCUMENTA, and they said, "You're kidding." You know, the last time this happened was like 1968, and okay. But the question was always, but it's not art. So it vacillated almost into it, but then it was not art. But Cumela's ideas were purely within the history of modern art. If you read Cumela and Cumela's thoughts, they are completely about democracy and form and shape and how one can make a modern, how one can reinvent democracy and form through these shapes. But we won't go into that. But next to it was this. So these are the two by Juana Marta Rodas and Julia Isidres. These two vessels have no top, have no opening. They are first, like much pottery around the world, look like non-human animals. They are little hands and heads and so on. But the characteristic is this fact that there is no opening. Actually, on the back side, there are two little holes. But the point of it is to not have. So it's a containing without an orifice in a way. So we're back at this mug. So, but your hand is not actually touching the mug. Sure, you can feel the smooth surface of the mug's exterior, right where your fingers come into contact with it or seem to. But what you are actually sensing is the electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons of the atoms that make up your fingers and those that make up the mug. Electrons are tiny negatively charged particles that surround the nuclei of atoms. And having the same charges, they repel one another, much like powerful little magnets. As you decrease the distance between them, the repulsive forces increases. So if you bring them closer and closer and closer, then it's more repulsive. So because they are so close, when the density, the dust becomes the clay, becomes the mug, you are densifying the atoms and therefore the electrons. As you decrease the distance between them, the repulsive forces increases. Try as you might, you cannot bring two electrons into direct contact with each other. The reason the desk feels solid or the cat's coat feels soft or we can even hold coffee cups in one another's hands is an effect of electromagnetic repulsion. All we really ever feel is the electromagnetic force, not the other whose touch we seek. Atoms are mostly empty space, and electrons, which lie at the farthest reaches of an atom, hinting at its perimeter, cannot bear direct contact. Electromagnetic repulsion, negatively charged particles communicating at distance, push each other away. That is the tale physics usually tells about touching. Repulsion at the core of attraction. See how far that story gets you with lovers. No wonder the romantic poets had had enough. Classical physics. I love this. And also Nietzsche had had enough with it all in actual conversations and his ideas around vitality and his criticism of positivistic science and so on. But of course, Nietzsche then did theory. He was very alone, I think, in his life as a human. He didn't do much touching, I think. I mean,
He died of syphilis.
yeah, but
He went mad from syphilis. He did an awful lot of
I don't know about, you think so?
Yeah.
I thought that that was the only way that there was any touching in his life, and he was in love with the wife of Wagner, and he never touched her and all that. You know, at least the story, one of the stories goes, this is a kind of contradictory relationship with his own desires and his ability to be in relations. And
I really watched Leah Cavani's movie about him, so I just
well,
know there's
I
an
didn't
awful lot
read
of
that.
sex in it.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
So I think, but that's like most of those men. That's where that's why he went mad. He had.
yeah.
And he went mad after holding the horse, kissing the horse. Have you ever seen that fantastic movie called, The Turin Horse?
Oh, no, I haven't. The Turin horse, because indeed he was in
Whatever
Turin.
happened to the horse after Nietzsche kissed him? We know what happened to Nietzsche after he kissed the horse, but it's a wonderful, in this story, yeah, so.
Well, anyway,
he-
but there's many ways of touching. I don't know. I always imagine him as very solitary, talking about vitalism and all that stuff, but being so alone. I mean, in the letters to this wife of Wagner, and he seemed very.
Yeah, by then, I think, yeah.
Anyway, okay. So here we are. See how far the story gets you. Okay, the quantum theory of touching is radically different from the classical explanation. Actually, it is radically queer, as we will see. So here we go into another story of touching. Quantum field theory, which doesn't make that other story wrong. It's not that classical analysis of physics, it's not at all wrong. It's just a different story of the same thing. Of a different thing. It's a different story of a different thing. Or the same story of the same thing. Or the same story of a different thing. Or the different story of the same thing. Quantum field theory allows for something radically new in the history of Western physics, the transience of matter's existence. No longer suspended in eternity, matter is born, lives, and dies. But even more than that, there is a radical deconstruction of identity and of the equation of matter with essence in ways that transcend even the profound undoings of non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Quantum field theory, now I don't quite understand what that just said, what she just said. Wait a minute. Even more than that, there is a radical deconstruction of identity, and in what? In quantum field theory, in ways that transcend even the profound undoings of quantum mechanics. I've always seen quantum mechanics as synonym of quantum field theory, so I'm not sure I understand what she's saying here.
Are the two, is relativity and quantum mechanics are the two different accounts, and that's why they're trying to find the unifying theory now, which is to bring the two accounts of the physical world together. But I don't, so it may be, I'll look it up.
But it says, in ways that transcend even the profound undoings of non-relativistic quantum mechanics. I mean, I understood quantum mechanics as a synonym of quantum field theory, as a synonym of quantum physics, for me. But maybe it's different historical periods of the science, and maybe at the time of Niels Bohr and Schrödinger we talk about quantum mechanics, and then it's develops into this, and okay, oh God, so go up a little bit. Also known as quantum mechanics or quantum theory.
Yeah, I think it is.
It's a branch of physics which deals with, but she's making a distinction, which deals with physical phenomena on microscopic scales, quanta square.
Quantum field theory is the theory that developed later to combine quantum mechanics with relativity.
Yes, okay, so when she speaks of non-relativistic quantum mechanics, she's speaking of the first period of thinking about physics on a subatomic level. Quanta being subatomic level of physical entities. So when you combine subatomic physics with relativity, it becomes quantum field theory. But today it's used almost as synonyms in most people's vision.
I think that it might be split between Einstein's two. I think it might be the specific one and the general relativity that he did. It might be to do with that, where now the two things are combined. It might be worth looking at the two Einstein theories.
So quantum field theory is especially useful for describing systems where the particle count number may change over time, a crucial feature of relativistic dynamics, whereas quantum mechanics seem to be suggesting that there were specific numbers.
Yes, it's before. So basically, it's quantum mechanics is simply the physics, the classical physics, non-relativistic classical physics on a level of scale of subatomic particles. So what we're talking about, what she is a quantum physics person. So we won't use quantum mechanics anymore as a synonym of quantum physics, because it's not.
If you take this definition, it's okay. So that if the quantum mechanics deals with subatomic particles,
Yes.
right? Quantum field goes below that to a force field.
Well, it goes to the
where they are
relativity.
Field quanta, not particles.
Yes, but also there are superposition of states. So one is both dead and alive, the Schrödinger cat. Okay. Okay, so
Quantum field theory.
quantum field theory, I will argue below, is a call, an alluring murmur from the insensible within the sensible to radically rework the nature of being and time. Yes, the insights this is where it's going to help us to distinguish the new materialists in feminist science studies from the object-based philosophers, which are much more banal than this in their definition of what is matter, if we can get to read Quentin Messayou or Graham Harman.
So who are the object?
Object-based philosophy are the speculative realists.
Right.
They are Ray Brassier, Graham Harman, Quentin Messayou, Tristan Garcia, and a few others that are very popular now and being read a lot by artists around the world. And they are basically a shift from constructivism, which is that we build the world, we construct it, to realism, that the world exists beyond us. And it's a new kind of fashion, which I find interesting. I mean, this is one of the most well-known texts of that. Bruno Latour is also steeped in object-based philosophy, but I think Bruno Latour is able to complexify it and to see all of this differences. So, but that's one of the propositions, is to read those texts and try to compare these visions. Because for a quantum physicist, you have to change the definition of reality, because reality is information, and at the same time, information is reality. It's not abstract. That's sort of the paradox that it allows us to hold. Quantum field theory differs. Oh no, the insights of quantum field theory are crucial, but the philosophical terrain is rugged, slippery, and mostly unexplored. The question is, what's note number 7? When there is talk of quantum physics, and especially when there is a consideration of its philosophical implications, the theory at issue, though it is usually not specified, is non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Quantum field theory goes further, combining the insights of quantum mechanics, special relativity, and classical field theories. The philosophical implications of quantum field theory are much less explored. See, for example, these various people. Okay, so we have to go deeper into this at some point. Probably not together, but each on our own. We will need to be in and of the science, no way around it. Unfortunately, in the limited space I have here, I can only lightly touch, just barely graze the surface. It's not beautiful graze, to go from touch to graze, because that could open up a whole discussion around Vandana Shiva, ecofeminism, and all the rest of it. How to lightly touch is to barely graze the surface. 8, what is surface? It has been my practice and my commitment to provide a sufficiently rich sense of the science that the reader can see how the storyline holds together, even if there is not sufficient time or space to fully develop it. But here I can only offer a few hints. Okay, so she's going to give the science now. Quantum field theory differs from classical physics, not only in its formalism, but in its ontology. In its nature of being, in its understanding its nature of being. Classical physics inherits a Democritean ontology, only particles and the void, with one additional element, fields. So, Democritus is, of course, the ancient Democritus, Roman, Democritus. Greek. And he's after Heraclitus, later, I think, yes. Okay, Democritean ontology. So there is a void, and then there's these particles floating around in the void. Mm-hmm.
I have to stop actually for a moment because, again, I need to ensure that Steve gets some food. Could we, as we're about to go into that, could we hold off and then we'll take a little bit more, see what a vote of people are happy to continue reading this
essay
after lunch when you've had something, because you might not take quantum field theory in without food, and I know you get very weak without food particularly. So would that be before we launch onto that, because, and then maybe we can decide when we come back to carry on, because it does, I think we will get hold of something very...
Yes, I think we should read it personally.
We're getting to the crux of the difference.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it would give us one grounded